So now that we looked at one extreme type of market, perfect competition, which is the extreme version of a market in which there are a bunch of firms competing with each other for a market that wants what they're selling ostensibly, which is a good way of approximating a lot of economic activity in developed economies. There is another extreme to consider, and we're going to look at the two extremes first because everything that happens in the middle, the other two market structures, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, share features of both. And we need to understand the two extremes before we can understand the more realistic and common middle grounds. So, excuse me. So, pure monopoly. We call it pure monopoly because in practice, a lot of firms are defined as monopolies simply because they have a really large market share, but not 100% of the market. Pure monopolies do have 100% of the market and zero competition. So we are going to talk a little bit about more realistic monopolies who do have a few competitors, but they're too small to really matter too much to alter their decision making from what we're going to look at from the standpoint of pure monopolies. And again, remember, we simplify our models so that we can get a grip on what's basically going on in the real world. Looking at the simplified version helps us understand the more complex dynamics in the real world. You can see elements of the simplified thing. So, just like with perfect competition, we had several definitional features, things that had to be the case for a market to be a perfectly competitive market. You needed to have all of them. And we're going to do that for every market structure. So for monopoly, those features are, of course, a single seller. Remember, with perfect competition, we had many firms, which we didn't have a particular number. It was just sufficient to say that there were enough firms to where the competition was so fierce nobody could really affect the market all by themselves. They couldn't try to raise or lower the price and expect that to impact the rest of the market. That would just impact their ability to bring people in the door and pay their costs, which is why they were price takers. And again, this is the opposite extreme. One firm, just one firm, no competition. Just to keep it simple, no competition. In practice, no real competition. But to keep it simple, no competition. One firm, just one, only one. And remember, with perfect competition, the products were homogenized, standardized, no product differentiation. It all means the same thing. That doesn't really apply for monopolies. Standardized products applies for markets with a lot of different firms who are competing for consumers, but they all sell the exact same thing. Monopolies aren't competing with anybody. And to make that work, this is actually very important. To make that work, the product has to have no close substitutes in order to have a true monopoly situation. If you have a close substitute where the drop in utility for choosing a competitor's product in order to save a few pennies is not that large, then there's just too much competition. And that actually, there is a market we're going to talk about that behaves like that. But here, if you're not going to buy the product being sold by the monopolist, your drop in utility is going to be massive. So massive that even if you're a little ticked about the high price you have to pay to the monopolist, you're going to do it because there's no other choice. One example of this would be cable companies. For a number of reasons, there are a lot of places where you get one cable company or you don't get cable TV. And for a lot of people, they can afford to pay the higher prices of cable, so they do. And they tolerate higher prices and poor customer service because the alternative is bunny ears on a TV, network television through an antenna, and it's just not as many channels, not as many options, picture quality that in some people's cases, depending on where you live and the antenna you buy, is not very good. So it's too big of a drop in utility to consider anything to be a substitute. So this product has no close substitutes. Maybe some sort of kind of substitutes, but the point of a substitute not being close is that the utility drop is huge. You're going to be much less happy if you don't just shell out the extra money. And we'll see why you have to shell out the extra money. And then the high barriers to entry is related to the one loan firm. Very important. Because think about, as we're going to see, monopolies can make profits, and sometimes those profits can be really, really large. Remember, with perfect competition, if firms were making profits, well, what are you doing not opening a business in that industry if it's easy to open a business? If you can do what other people are doing and making a ton of money, do it. Make you some money. Heck yeah. Problem is, if everybody's doing it, competition becomes so stiff that prices start to fall and profits are eliminated. With pure monopolies, if you have profits going on, you're not going to have one firm for very long, are you? People are going to try to compete. But if there are high barriers to entry, no competition. And we will get into where these high barriers to entry comes from, what they look like when we get to that. But suffice it to say for now that you're not going to have one firm if you have low barriers to entry. It's just not gonna last because that one firm dominates the market. So you got to have high barriers to entry to maintain monopolies. So a few more assumptions. Remember, we had to make some other assumptions about perfect competitions, like all output is sold. To complicate things by saying maybe some output won't be sold, that's for more advanced analysis, for different questions, for understanding the basic functions of a market right now, and for a lot of more advanced models too. It's a complication that can be easily avoided without changing the results, to say that whatever you make, if you're a firm in this industry, if you bother to produce the output, you're going to be able to sell it at the market price, no problem. Now remember, we had that perfectly elastic demand curve in perfectly competitive markets, which meant that if you raise your price by 1 penny, your sales go from however many units you were selling, even if it was in the millions, all the way to 0. And if you drop that price by 1 penny, you get the entire market. You won't be able to pay your costs, so you'll go out of business, but you get the entire market. Perfectly, infinitely, impossibly elastic demand curve. Here with monopolies, that's no longer the case. In fact, the monopoly demand curve is the market demand curve, because monopoly is the market, and we're going to revisit that too. This right here is super important. Firms are price makers. Remember that in perfect competition, firms were price takers. The market sets the price. All the different firms trying to compete for customers while also being able to pay their costs and have enough accounting profit to justify remaining in business. Those dynamics result in a price emerging that you have to charge. You charge less, you can't cover your costs, you go out of business. Or you can't justify remaining in business instead of getting a higher paying job. If you raise your price, you don't sell to anybody. So you're a price taker with perfect competition. Not so with monopolists. Remember, you don't have any competition. You set your own price. Now, a lot of people will run into the trap of thinking that it doesn't matter what price you charge. That you can basically charge infinity dollars and you're good. You'll still make money. But then that doesn't seem right. But so what is the limit? We'll get to that. There are limits, and those limits have to do with the fact that while the demand curve is no longer perfectly elastic, nor is it perfectly inelastic. Again, that's not anything that really exists in reality. There are highly inelastic demands, but there's, as we've discussed, there's a point to which people will say, you know what, I can't afford to buy food. I'll just die, you know. I'll just try to enjoy my remaining days with what little money I have rather than blow it all on food so I can live one more day. Screw it. So there's no such thing in the real world as perfectly inelastic demand, but you can have highly inelastic demand. But even then, there's a limit to how much people will pay. So we will get to that, but firms are still price makers, meaning there's price flexibility, and we actually call that market power. Market power does not necessarily mean that you can grease politicians or abuse your competitors. Monopolists don't have competitors. What market power means is you have price flexibility. You don't have to charge marginal costs like in perfect competition. You can charge more in the long run. And if you don't want to charge the highest price the market will bear because it feels mean, you don't have to, and you can still make some positive profit. We'll see how that works too. But you can charge the highest price the market will bear. There's a lot of price flexibility. So you are a price maker. You determine your costs, you determine market demand, you determine the price. You don't have to worry about what anybody else is charging. And because of that, you can make economic profits in the long run. In the long run, in perfect competition, you could do it in the short run. With monopoly, now you can make positive economic profits in the long run. It's no longer just a short run thing. And this is economic profit. It's not just accounting profit that you can have in the long run. It's economic profit. Can be positive. But again, careful not to think that it's inevitable. It is possible for monopolies to lose money. Because again, there's only so much that people are willing to pay for something. And you could be making money as a monopolist, and then something happens in the market, demand drops, and now you can't make money anymore. So markets change, that sort of thing does happen, and we'll see how that works graphically. But don't think that it's inevitable that all monopolists always make positive economic profit. It's just it is now something that can be maintained in the long run. Because that scenario that we saw with perfect competition where firms will enter if they see positive economic profits and that will cause them to go away, that doesn't happen with monopoly because of those high barriers to entry. So that sets up what these are. There's one more thing before getting into the mechanisms of how it works, and that is monopoly power. What we mean by monopoly power is that it's not just the prices, you can also control the quantities. With perfect competition, we didn't really underscore this with perfect competition, but if you don't make the optimal quantity for your firm, if you don't produce the quantity where your marginal costs equals marginal revenue, you're not optimizing, you're not profit maximizing. Remember, profit maximization in the long run means zero economic profit. So if you don't make the optimal quantity, then you're making negative profit, and you can't sustain that in the long run for perfect competition. But for monopolies, you can control the quantities a little bit. If you're a sole proprietor but a monopolist, and you can make more output and sell it at a steep price, steep enough to make a large profit, but you just don't want to put in the effort to make more output, so you're willing to accept less profit in order to save yourself some time and energy, you can do that and remain in business in the long run. So both quantities and prices, there's some discretion for the monopolist, and that is the essence of monopoly power. We'll get into how marginal revenue works starting in the next video just to make sure that these stay